Well, welcome everybody, and on behalf of the Asia Scotland Institute, thank you for signing into this webinar, where we're absolutely delighted to have Willie Dalrymple in India talking to us about his upcoming book, The Golden Road. And I just wanted to
apologise for coming on Indian Standard Time, 10 minutes late. Apologies.
That's all right. Well, it's rude to be early, isn't it? Exactly. So,
very rude. Very rude.
To remind those that are on this call listening in, Willie is a very distinguished historian and writer, brought up in Scotland, educated there and also at Trinity College, Cambridge. And it's worth just recalling, this is how he has been described in one of his previous books. I quote from Alexander McCall Smith, a writer who can make the most recondite historical issues come alive. And with each successive book, he becomes a more entertaining and enlightening companion. And so he does. So, Willie, I'm so pleased you could join us to talk about your new book, The Golden Road, which I quote, aims to highlight India's sometimes forgotten position as a crucial economic and civilizational hub at the heart of the ancient and early medieval history of Eurasia. You've uncovered a vibrant, brilliant history that few others noticed or chose to bring forward. And this is your 11th book. So let's start off by my asking you, how did you come to write this history at this particular time?
Well, Roddy, I should say perhaps that this is up front. That this is still a work in progress. The book is not published and will not be out for another year. And indeed, tomorrow I am getting the manuscript out to begin a series of rewrites. So what you're seeing here is very much a work in progress. And I'm delighted to say I'm one of the very first people to catch a glimpse of this work in progress, Roddy. And
well, that's wonderful.
Better place to launch it than the Asia Scotland Institute
on
an unsuspecting world. But I decided to write this. For the last 20 years, I've been writing a 4-volume history of the East India Company. The whole story of colonialism and the role, in many ways, that both Scotland and England played in well, how does one put it? In drawing a lot of the wealth of India to the shores of Scotland. And if you look around Edinburgh, many of our finest country houses are built by gentlemen who joined the East India Company and returned with mysteriously large fortunes to build very gorgeous Georgian mansions around the Firth of Forth and up the east coast of Scotland. This, I've been doing this for 20 years. There are 4 volumes, the last of which, The Anarchy, came out a couple of years ago. And it's very nice to return to a very different period of history when the relationship of East and West is quite different, when Scotland and England are still, I mean, the Scots were making wild noises behind Hadrian's Wall at the same time that India was producing probably around half of the world's GDP and was an extraordinarily rich and powerful civilizational hub. I think that partly the growth of the idea of the Silk Road has led many people to think that the main center of East-West contact in antiquity was between Rome and China. We should remember that the notion of a Silk Road is only a 19th century idea invented by a German geographer called von Richthofen, the Seidenstrasse that he came up with. And while it's certainly an extremely important concept in the Middle Ages, from about the 13th century onwards, particularly during the Mongol period, when a single Mongol polity stretched between China and the Mediterranean, that was not at all the case in the classical period. And there's actually very little evidence that Rome and China were clearly aware of each other's existence at all. And there's very, very little evidence of trade between the two. But at this early period, at the same time that there is very little evidence of any Roman-China contact, Rome and India were in direct contact through the Red Sea. And that after Augustus conquers Cleopatra's Egypt, Rome had a a direct launching point to trade directly with India. And we know that by the time of Pliny, only a generation later, or a couple of generations after Augustus, around the time Pliny dies when Pompeii goes off, when Vesuvius goes off in AD 79. By that time, there were 250 vessels trading out of one port alone with India. And Pliny is very anxious that, in fact, the wealth of Rome is debouching out into India, which he sees as like your and my father, Roddy, were both in the army, and could often be rather austere figures from that generation who were disdainful of metropolitan luxuries. The same was true of Pliny, who was a naval man, and he writes how it is the taste of Roman matrons for Indian silks, ivories, and spices that is leading good Roman gold to bucket out into the pockets of Indian merchants. And I'd love to just share my screen and show you some images.
Please do, please do.
Can you see that, Roddy?
Yes, we got it. Yep, yep.
This, incidentally, the first image is a rather wonderful image of the Buddha recently found on the Red Sea coast of Egypt, and is a wonderful image of India's presence in the Roman world. And what's interesting is that the new India-Middle East economic corridor that Mr. Modi has recently opened with the support of Biden and MBS follows exactly the route that the Roman trade route went.
This was at the G20 meeting, is that right?
The G20 a few months ago. And you can see here this map of the first century trade routes. You can see that from the west coast of India, a whole range of ports are heading, that follow those little red dots,
yep.
Through past what's now Aden, up into the Red Sea and the Arabian Gulf. And this is where this wonderful Buddha was found, on one of these ports, the port of Berenike. And just to compare you, this is the kind of classic image of what the Silk Road used to look like. You can see we have all these wonderful trade routes going overland between Luoyang, Chang'an, which is modern Xi'an, over through Central Asia and reaching Mediterranean at Tyre and Antioch. And that's all very well for the Middle Ages. But if you actually look at the map of Roman coin hoards here, you can see where Rome is trading with. And as you can see, Rome is very much an empire which is based around the Mediterranean. That even Scotland has a wonderful scattering of Roman coin hoards. But look to the east. There is nothing going overland at all. There are no Roman coins being found in modern east of modern Turkey, in modern Iran, in Mesopotamia, or Central Asia. But there are many coin hoards found around the coast of India. And this is an indication of the scale of Roman trade with India through this route. And so it's a central part of my thesis that through this route you get an extraordinary east-west dialogue going on from Roman times onwards, and that it's following the sea road through the Red Sea. And out of this, you get the book develops to put into three parts, really, from this base. It talks, first of all, about the way that Indian ideas travel, in the first part of my book, up to China, and how Buddhism, which is a set of religious and philosophical ideas probably put together by Siddhartha Gautama in the 5th century BC, how that travels overland up through the Himalayas and the Pamirs to China, so that you have Buddhism taking over China by the 7th century. This is the first part of the book. The second part of the book talks about how Indian religion and Indian trade and Indian influence travels to Southeast Asia, leading eventually to the largest Hindu temple in the world being built not in India but in Angkor Wat in Cambodia, in the Mekong Delta, and Indian Buddhist merchants traveling equally to Southeast Asia, and the largest Buddhist monument in the world being founded in Borobudur on the island of Java in Indonesia. So first we deal with China, secondly with Southeast Asia, and finally, coming through to the Middle Ages, the book talks about the way that Indian ideas of numbers and mathematics travel back westwards, so that the Indian number system and the Indian decimal system,
Zero.
and the idea of zero, all essential ideas for mathematics and astronomy and astrology, travel first from India to the Arab world, and then on to medieval Italy. So there's far more that we owe to India and to the influence of India that I think people are aware. It's like the civilizational effect that ancient Greece has on the rest of Europe, these ideas diffusing outwards through the power of their sophistication and their attractiveness, which is why, as you walk from your office, Roddy, through the new town of Edinburgh, you see all these wonderful Grecian facades and Playfair's beautiful buildings in the new town.
Yes.
In the same way, you find India, an Indian civilization, doing that across particularly Asia, but also in ideas of mathematics and numbers to us in the West too.
Well, let me just interject a question. In your book, classical India comes across as a place of scientific and philosophical inquiry, as you've been saying. Will modern India continue this tradition and become a science superpower? And how will this be affected by President Modi's current positioning?
Prime Minister Modi.
Prime Minister,
so we find India has got a remarkable, and always has done, a remarkable reputation for mathematics and numbers. And if you look at the CEOs of all the major computer companies in the Bay Area, Microsoft, Apple, and half the rest of them have now got Indian CEOs. And there is obviously a massive concentration of Indian technical ability across the Bay Area. So it's already happening. And as we all know, India is dotted with IT professionals trained up in the very, very high standards of the Indian IITs, the Institutes of Technology, originally set up by Nehru. So that is already, it's already a thing. That's not looking into the future. As I'm sure many of your guests from India, including the High Commissioner, Mr. Doraiswamy Vikram, has told you when he was talking to you. As we know, India has already overtaken Britain as the fifth economy of the world, and within a decade, in all probability, will overtake both Japan and Germany to become the third economy in the world. So this is something which is not, distant pie in the sky, looking into the future. This is imminent realities which are changing around us.
Yep. Yeah. Oh, well, and indeed, we have a prime minister of Indian origin, although born in England.
Though sadly, I suspect who will not be with us for much longer, but that's a different story, Roddy.
Well, he went to the right school. I don't know what happened then. Right. How do you see the relationship between India and China developing on the back of this? There are other scholars, of course, whom we know, who've talked all about the Silk Road and the Belt and Road project of the Chinese. But that, of course, as you pointed out, comes later. But how will the relationship develop? And do you see scholarship coming together around the subject which you're writing about?
Well, one of the interesting things is that, let me show some more images from my presentation just to show you the sort of world we're talking about. There is an extraordinary movement of Indian ideas and art into China in the 5th, 6th, and 7th century. And you find Indian sculptural ideas like this wonderful Buddha from Mathura influencing on the right early Indian Buddhas across the Northern Way and other Chinese centers of Buddhism, and these extraordinary Central Asian centers of Buddhism by the 5th and 6th century, where Indian ideas are passing very strongly into China. And the most interesting thing of all is Xuanzang, who we see here on the right, this famous Buddhist pilgrim who crosses from China to go and visit the great Indian University of Nalanda. And again, I think people in Britain may not be aware of the degree of sophistication of these Indian universities, which were the Oxbridge or the Harvard and Yale of their day. And Xuanzang makes this arduous journey overland to India and writes 6 kings built as many monasteries around the site, one after another. An enclosure was made of bricks to merge them into one monastery with one common entrance. There were separate courtyards divided into 8 departments. Precious terraces ranged like stars in the sky, and jade stories pavilions spired like lofty peaks. As temples stood high in mist, and the shrines hovered over rosy clouds. And then the biggest thing of all he talks about is the library. Again, we all know about the Library of Alexandria, which was obviously the great library of the Mediterranean world. But Nalanda was its equivalent in Asia. And Xuanzang goes to Nalanda because of the scholars, the scholarship, the scholars, and the library. He talks about 10,000 monks studying the different schools of Buddhism, as well as the Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, Sanskrit, astronomy, literature, and magic. And here are the remains of the library, which was 9 stories high and contained 3 divisions. The Ratnadadi, the Sea of Jewels, the Ratna Sagara, the Ocean of Jewels, and the Ratna Rajaka, the jewel adorned. The priests say, Xuanzang, men of the highest ability and talent. Their distinction is very great. The day is not sufficient for asking and answering profound questions from morning until night. The monks engage in discussions. The young and old mutually help each other. And the lectures were given in 100 different lecture halls each day. So again, this sort of period when we got Picts running around Scotland now in the 6th and 7th century, producing gorgeous symbol stones, but not many of the great Scottish universities yet in evidence. No St Andrews, no Aberdeen, not even the University of Edinburgh. But here in Bihar, you have the greatest library and the greatest universities of their time. And Chinese scholars are coming from China to India to learn about astronomy, mathematics, and so on. And so this part of my book is about this enormous transfusion of scholarship, which I think is largely forgotten today, from India to China, and with Buddhism, which takes over the state and becomes the state religion under the empress. There's this wonderful empress who I write a great deal about, called Wu Zetian. Here she is, top left in her what she actually looked like, but she's recently become the center of a 100-part Chinese soap opera, in this very alluring form that we see at the bottom here. And she's the woman who, because she takes over and becomes the only woman emperor as opposed to empress. She is the emperor in the 7th century. In 664, she takes over, and because the Confucians do not allow women emperors, she converts China effectively to Buddhism and makes Buddhism the state religion. And at that moment, with Buddhism, comes into the Chinese cultural sphere all these Indian ideas of cosmology, astronomy, astrology, which seep in and transform China. And again, we think of China as this very sort of self-contained, sort of barrack country that has given out, but very rarely taken in ideas from outside, at least before the Lord Macartney and the East India Company barged in the 18th century. But this is not the case. In reality, China is very much a place that has taken in the ideas of India and been transformed by it. And although Buddhism loses the premier place it held under the Empress Wu, the ideas of India come through this trapdoor, if you like, into China at this period. And there's a wholesale takeover of China, of Chinese intellectual life by Indian monks and Buddhist ideas.
Willie, I've got a question here from someone, as it were, in the audience. Zainab Ahmed. He says, do you find the influences of India to be similar to influence of other South Asian regions, such as Pakistan or Bangladesh? How would you characterize the distinction between these regions?
Well, of course, India at the time is a cultural unit that embraces all of South Asia, including what is now Pakistan and Bangladesh. Pakistan and Bangladesh both being at this period major Buddhist centers. Everyone in Pakistan knows about the wonderful Gandharan sculpture. I might show some images here, which these wonderful Buddhas that you find very Roman influence. Here on the right is a picture of Augustus, on the left a Gandharan Buddha from Peshawar in Pakistan, and here again more of these beautiful figures. Now everyone knows these gorgeous Gandharan Buddhas and these very classical features that they have. This is a token of the close influence of Rome and early 1st, 2nd, 3rd century South Asia. But in the early period, South Asia is split up into at least 60 kingdoms. When Xuanzang crosses into what he regards India at Jalalabad, modern Afghanistan, above the Khyber Pass, he talks about India as a geographical and cultural unit, which he's entering, like saying you're crossing Hellespont into Asia. But he's aware that it has no single state ruling it. It is split into 60 warring and competitive kingdoms. And so you've got to reimagine a world where South Asia has 3 countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and think of it as a single cultural and geographical unit that has 60 kingdoms, dividing the area up. And one of the features of this that I was very struck by when I was writing the book is that India has this massive cultural influence over China, over Southeast Asia, and eventually over Europe, the European mathematical mind. But it is never a dominant political unit at this point because it's so split up. Unlike China, which has a version of the modern Chinese state occupying great swathes of modern China, India only has very brief moments under, for example, the Mauryas, then briefly again under the Guptas. When wholesale chunks of India are controlled by a single ruler. The norm in India is that you have smaller kingdoms. And therefore, you find that the most extravagant buildings using Indian ideas are built not in India, but in Java or Cambodia, places that fall under India's cultural sway. And the sort of thing I'm talking about here, again, just to jump and show some illustrations here, we've got early in the 7th century. On the left, you've got the great Pallava temple in Mahabalipuram. And on the right, a very similar temple in Java, built very much on the same sort of architectural model, but with the lovely curling eaves that you get from China. And then a little bit later, in the 8th century, 9th century, you've got Borobudur, the largest Buddhist monument of the world, very much following Indian models, but built slightly different style in Indonesia and Java. And soon after that, by the 12th century, you've got Angkor Wat, the largest Hindu temple in the world, coming up not in India, but in the Mekong, in what's now Cambodia.
Elizabeth Marshall asks, did the Jade Buddha temple in Shanghai come from this time?
I'm ashamed to say I don't know the Jade Buddhist temple in Shanghai, but the main centers of Indian influence in China are on the coast, and you get Hindu temples by the 12th century developing in the coastal ports, like opposite Hong Kong, up that coast. You've got examples of actual Chola temples being built on the Hindu model, and all over China you've got pagodas developing. When, for example, when Xuanzang goes back to China during the reign of the first Tang Emperor, Taozang, he builds the Wild Goose Pagoda in Xi'an to house his manuscripts that he brings from Nalanda. And so you get this influence of Indian Buddhist monastic architecture in places like Luoyang and Xi'an.
People have asked me to ask you, how do you do your research to build your knowledge for a book of this sort? What's your technique? Where do you go to look for stuff?
Well, this was a rather different project to the stuff I've been doing over the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, it's been very much manuscript-based, getting Persian language sources out of the British Library and places and libraries all over India, particularly the National Archives, translating the Persian stuff and trying to find new Mughal perspectives on familiar periods of East India Company history, which are the East India Company obviously had left about 30 miles of documents underneath the British Library, the extraordinary quantities of stuff. So that is a very rich field for research, and that there's almost unlimited quantities of material, both on the Mughal and on the British side, to work from. With this, it's a very different story. It's I'm using mainly archaeology, art history, and epigraphy at this period. You have far more limited manuscripts for this sort of period of history, and you're using numismatics, the study of coins, and looking a lot at architecture and art history to tell the story. So it's been a lovely holiday from my usual work in libraries, and involved indeed very nice post-COVID trips to Cambodia and Indonesia and so on, researching this book. I was in Borobudur on my own, this wonderful monument in Indonesia. It was still closed for COVID, and I managed to approach the culture minister and had something which I will never have again in my life, to be alone with the archaeologists in Borobudur, having the whole monument just to myself and the scholar I was going around with. Is a wonderful privilege that will never be repeated. I had a fantastic series of trips.
It's a wonderful story. I realize still in the telling because the book is to come out in a year's time. But do you expect some of what you're writing to be challenged by others who might be perhaps more pro-China?
Well, we'll see. We'll see. I think the main outlines of what I'm saying are pretty uncontroversial.
Yeah.
I'm sure there will be, as ever, there will be details which people will quibble and dispute. But the main center of commerce in the classical period was between India, East-West contact was between India and China, not India. Sorry, India and Rome, not China. Rome seems to me beyond dispute. There's a wonderful. Just to give you some of the scale that we're talking about. There's this manuscript, this extraordinary manuscript called the Maziris Papyrus, which is now in Vienna, and it is a very modern document. It's a loan and a shipping contract taken out by a Roman, or probably actually Romano-Greek merchant based in Alexandria, and he's making a shipping invoice to a merchant in Kerala. Right. And he gives and it's the contents of a single container that is being sent from Kerala to Alexandria, which contains extremely expensive consignment of ivory and nard, which is this aromatic oil, which, if you remember from your Bible, Roddy, I'm sure you're a great follower of the New Testament as a pillar of the Church of Scotland, and you will remember Martha and Mary. And Martha puts nard over the feet of Christ. That came from India, this luxury item. Anyway, in this shipment, which has randomly survived in a rubbish dump in Egypt, we have the details of the taxes put by the Roman authorities onto these very expensive luxury consignments coming from India. And by the 1st century CE, Indian imports to Egypt were probably worth about 1 billion sesterces, from which the Roman authorities creamed off no less than 270 million in customs taxes, if this document is representative. And these vast revenues surpass those of entire country. In comparison, Julius Caesar imposes tribute of 40 million sesterces after his conquest of Gaul. And the Rhineland frontier was defended by 8 legions, an annual cost of 88 million sestertii. So you actually have a figure being suggested now whereby a third of the entire Roman budget for the entire empire was paid for on the customs revenue of all the Indian imports coming up through the Red Sea. And again, I think it's just, it requires a bit of mental agility for us, brought up in a world where Europe was so dominant. And where, again, when we're studying the classical period, we think of Rome as, the Colosseum, the riches of Rome, the might of Rome. But Rome is itself massively in debt, with a severe balance of payments problem to the merchants of India. And that little map we had of all these coin hoards found across the coast of India illustrates that what Pliny was saying about the expenditure of Roman matrons on their silks and jewelry did indeed lead to a great rush of Roman gold into India.
Now, a map that took us further east, as you say, which shows the influence of India and Indian culture on other places like Indonesia and elsewhere, wouldn't it?
Let's get that very map up. Here we go. Here we have the maritime routes coming from India eastwards. And you can see that what, again, you've got to remember is that the Silk Road and all these lovely romantic images of sort of camels and crossing the Pamirs with saddlebags full of carpets and things is all very well, but you can move far greater quantities in containers through the sea at this period, and the speed is incredible. India was always a centre of trade with a very unfair advantage over everyone else, in that the monsoon winds were extraordinarily helpful for Indian sailors moving at speed in both directions, because the Tibetan plateau heats up in summer and winds blow out one way, and then it cools in winter with the snows coming in, and and it sucks in air, so that you can move if you get your winds right. And sailors at this period had to operate on the monsoon winds. You could actually sail from, if you look in the kind of armpit of the Bay of Bengal, near what's now Calcutta, Tamrailipti, you could travel from Tamrailipti to Indonesia in 6 weeks.
Amazing.
And so, the equivalent of Singapore Airlines business class was to get on a very nice, fancy Bengali boat and find yourself in Indonesia or in Malaya or in Java. Keling is Java, or Kutai in what's now Borneo, or indeed up to Guangzhou and the China coast. And you could do these journeys, if you get the monsoon right, in 2 or 3 months. Then you have to wait for the winds to turn around. So once you're there in Bujang or Palembang, you might be stuck for 3 or 4 months, which suits a merchant, because you then can unpack your cargo and sell it and set up your trading arrangements. And then you have to hop back in 6 months later onto your boat, and in as little as 6 weeks, with the monsoon going in the opposite direction, you can find yourself back in Sri Lanka or in Tamrailipti, or in this map, Nagapattinam.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And Willie, I know you've outlined in your introduction that you shared with me, that you sent me, how the various chapters emerge. The chapter that concludes everything, what will your conclusion be, or is it, in your mind, having written this book?
Well, the honest truth is that the conclusion is one of the things that I'm having to give a very serious rewrite to, Roddy, over the next 6 weeks. So who knows what the conclusion will be? Because I'm rejigging it and making it more ambitious and raising my stakes on this one. But a chunk of world history that we've forgotten about. And the period of the timeline for this is Buddhism really begins to sort of emanate out of India with the Emperor Ashoka, about 250 BC.
Yes.
Hindu ideas really get going about 800 years later, and by the 3rd, 4th, 5th century AD, you have these Sanskrit spreading to Southeast Asia. So you have an Indian sacred language
Yes.
becoming the lingua franca all the way from Kandahar in modern Afghanistan through to Singapura, which is a Sanskrit name in Southeast Asia, and across Indonesia and Cambodia. You get epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata being the basis of shadow puppetry, ballet, dance, and all sorts of other things across this vast region. And what I've tried to do, I mean, none of this is new, but I think pulling it together into one picture of this massive often this is studied very well by scholars, but in quite separate departments. So the bit about Buddhism is often studied in Silk Road departments, like in the wonderful Professor Peter Frankopan's new chair at Cambridge deals very much with that sort of thing. The whole story of India's trade with Southeast Asia is normally dealt with and Sanskritization is dealt with in Sanskrit departments and in Chinese departments. And the story of India's mathematical prowess, I should just perhaps pull up a slide to show that what I'm talking about there. We have here, as you can see, this is 270. Those are the Sanskrit numerals for which we later take on in the 8th century, at a time when we're still in Europe. Our wonderful monks in Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, like the Venerable Bede, are still doing MX, CC, MLV, and that sort of thing. And try doing your long mathematics with that. Try multiply XX CLX with MCMV1, and you find it's a lot more difficult than with the Indian number system, with its digital, with its different decimal places.
Yes.
And here we have how these numbers reach us. And it starts off with the Ashoka, with Brahmi, and you can recognize 6 and 7 very clearly there at the top. It then goes to what I just showed you, the numbers at Gwalior by the 9th century, looking like that. And then it spreads to the Arab world with the rise of the Abbasid Empire and Baghdad. And you're getting two forms of Arabic, Eastern and Western Arabic. Eastern Arabic remains the Arabic system that you find in use today in Saudi Arabia or Syria or across the Arab today. But the Western Arabic, which were developed initially in places like Morocco and Algeria, go on to become the numbers that we use today. And there we end up with Dura in the 16th century with a very familiar set of numerals. But again, I think people, because we called them Arabic numerals, because that's where Europe got them from. And particularly the important figure here is perhaps a surprisingly familiar figure, Fibonacci. Fibonacci is a Pisan, Leonardo of Pisa, who grows up in Algeria, where his father runs a Pisan customs house. And he just, like my kids go to school in Delhi, he's sent to the local school. He learns this Arabic stuff just as a matter of course in his local school in Algeria. And so when he goes back to Pisa, he writes a book called the Liber Abaci, which brings this new number system that is later thought of as Arabic numerals to Europe. But he knows, and he calls his book the Indian number system. He says, in Algeria, I was introduced to a wonderful teaching that is called the 9 figures of India. Sign 0, which the Arabs call Zafar, al-Sifr, which is where we get our word cipher from, incidentally. Any number whatsoever can be written. Getting to know this pleased me far beyond all else, and I set my mind to it. Everything else seemed to me as a kind of error in comparison with this method of the Indians. Therefore, concentrating more closely on this and studying it more attentively, adding a few things of my own, and also putting some subtleties from Euclid's art of geometry, I made an effort to compose in as intelligible fashion as I could this book, so that those seeking knowledge could be instructed in such a perfect method that in future the Latin race may not be found lacking in mathematical knowledge. That's us, Roddy. We're the Latin race, and we have benefited from these Indian numbers, which came through the court of Frederick II in Sicily, with his lovely castle, which you should visit on your summer holidays in Puglia, and become the standard system in Italy, leading people like the Medicis to be able to build great banking empires using these advanced mathematical techniques imported from the Arab world originating in India. And then, of course, in the end, it gets printed. Fibonacci's work gets printed, Liber Abaci, in Venice just around the time Vasco da Gama arrives in Calicut. And to bring it full circle, it is, of course, that European commercial prowess that ultimately propels the East India Company back to India. The irony is that Europeans really use Indian commerce and mathematical techniques to subject India in the age of the East India Company, the 18th century.
Well, Willie, our hour is almost up, and you've taken us on an absolutely fascinating journey. We needed a guide because the map hasn't, as it were, been printed yet, so it's still developing in your head. But it's not for nothing. I know that you were recently appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire, CBE, in the King's Birthday Honours list for services to literature and the arts. So on behalf of all of us at the Age of Scotland Institute, congratulations on that.
Call me Commander, Roddy.
There we go, call you Commander from now on. But I just want to quote Barnaby Rogerson, who also wrote about you, a master storyteller who breathes such passion, vivacity, and animation into historical characters and events. And your enthusiasm, which is contagious, has really come across in this talk, for which we're hugely grateful. We look forward very much to welcoming you to Scotland when the actual book comes out as well. And also, just to mention to those on this webinar that next week we have the ambassador of the Philippines to the United Kingdom coming to Scotland to talk about what's going on there. So, Willie, huge vote of thanks to you. I know it's a busy day, and thank you for squeezing us into your Tuesday.
It's a great pleasure, Roddy, to have you here.
Well, great fun to be with you, and thanks for the talk and the wonderful illustrations as well. I love the mask behind you with the teeth on the wall. Yeah, there we go. So thanks.
Thank you, Roddy.
Yep.
Goodbye.
Bye to you all. Bye-bye then.